Hi, I'm Debbie with Book and Bujo. Welcome if you're new, welcome back if you've been here before. Today we're going over my September and October readathons. Alright, I had quite a few readathons that I participated in both in September and in October, so let's see how quick I can bust all these out. In September, I did take part in Sufferathon. Sort of. I didn't keep up with it as well as I did the previous year. I think I was just getting overwhelmed with everything I had to do, all the books I had to read, and I didn't put quite as much effort into it this time as I typically do. But I still had a lot of fun. So in week one, there was four co-hosts, and each week, each of them kind of had a little prompt, and you could kind of pick and choose your way through those. The first one is you take the number of books you read so far in 2024, and then you divide that by 35. So at that point, I had read 158 books, and dividing that by 35 is 4.5, and then you round up, and so that would be 5. So I had to read 5 books for that week. Luckily, I had quite a few small books on my TBR, and so I chose The Fall of the House of Usher, Shadow of the Bad Girl, Hex Life, Do Bigger Things, and Katana of Trust. I think that was the main prompt for the week. One of the optional prompts was if you were wearing neutral colors, you needed to unhaul or return a book. And I was wearing neutral colors at the time. I think I probably had gray on. So I took Knife of Dreams back to my library after I read it, of course. So that was a nice, fun little workaround for that prompt. Another one was I think these were all for week one. I think I didn't do my prompts here very well. Another one was you had to roll a die. If you rolled an even, you had to read the book. If it was an odd, you had to unhaul a book. And so I rolled a 1, of course, so I had to unhaul. And I don't unhaul books, so I used all my library books because that's all I had to get rid of. And I returned Saga Volume 6 after I read it, of course. And then your largest book, so you take the page count from your largest book, which for me at the time was Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke, and that was 986 pages, which I'm glad I didn't have the other copy. It was like 1,008 pages. That would have been really hard. And so you had to do a reverse page count and then read a book of that length. So I'm like, yeah, that would have been like 8,001 pages. So I'm glad I didn't have that copy. But that's still 689 pages. I took 3 books and added them together. So I did A Closed and Common Orbit, which was 365 pages, Shadow of the Batgirl, which was 208 pages, and Saga Volume 6, which was 152 pages. And then I just combined those, and that was fairly close to 689. It was a little off, but it was as close as I could get with the books that were on my TBR. And then week 2, I believe, there was something about having to read a book under 200 pages, and I read A Camp Half-Blood Confidential by Rick Riordan, and that was great. I loved it. And it was 100 and something pages. And then I just had all of my little notes and didn't actually put them into my journal. So, okay, this was week 2, and this was week 3, and then I didn't do anything for week 4. So yeah, I failed miserably for Sufferathon. So week 2, you had to do a spinner wheel with queer identities and a diversity. And I did get polyamorous, and I read Of Claws and Inferno by Kyoko M. It also had a mental health and disability rep in there. And I also actually read A Closed and Common Orbit, which has gender fluid identities in there. So that was great. The next prompt was read as many readathon books as possible, cramming. So that was an option, which I pretty much do that anyway. And then the last option was to read a Palestinian author and a translated book. You can double up. So I did read a translated book, which was A Sweet Daryusia by Maria Matios, but that was a Ukrainian author, and that's all I did. And I did not do the Wordle thing. So I did at least do something for week 2. Week 3. So I wrote out all of the options, and let's see if I actually did any of them. Read a book from a series you didn't finish in Sufferathon last year. you had to do a coin flip, and if it landed on heads, you had to read 3 books from that series or that author's backlist if you've already read everything. And then tails, it's 5 books. I did not do that one. And then the next option was Unexpected Family Reunion. Randomize a list of authors and read the entire backlist, which I did not do. Or a list of series currently in progress that you're in progress with and read the entire series, and I didn't do that either. Next option, choose an author you own more than 1 unread book from, then read all of those unread books, and I did not do that either. And then favorite book of the year so far. Find that author's lowest rated book and read that, or your worst book and read their highest rated. I didn't really do that either. So, okay, so I participated in the first 2 weeks. I did not do the last 2 weeks, so I feel really bad, but there it is. Life happens. Okay. Then I started the seasonal spooky challenge, which is by Covers with Cassidy, and I did read some books from here. So the first book I read fulfilled 2 prompts. So it was a book you didn't buy and a haunted house, and that was The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. The next one was an urban book that is also an audiobook, and for that I read A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair. And then the last one I read was an isolated book that was also a novella, and that was What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. So I did complete 3 of the books for this challenge, and this challenge runs from September, October, and November. So I read a few more in October, and we'll get to those in just a minute. For this readathon, you have to read a book that fulfills the first and the second sections. So read 1 book for each setting and an unlocking book, and these 2 need to go together. And then the third section is cover prompts, and then there's bonus challenges at the end. For the bonus challenge section down at the bottom, I did read a book with ghosts in them, and that was A Saga Volume 6. And then for the animal, I did read A Shadow of the Batgirl. And then lastly, we had vampires, and I read Awakened Vampire for that. Next up was the Goddess Complex Readathon, and that was put together by Beatriz Book Nook, and it was a lot of fun. I was on Team Athena, and for Team Athena, our prompts were a shield, a person on the cover, and for that one I did read Quicksilver by Callie Hart, and this one was great. The next prompt was a spear, so weapon on the cover, and for that I read Katana of Trust by A.C. Ward, and this is the first book in the Kami Prophecy series, and that was not too bad. Next up was Armor. Book depicts war, and I had planned on reading Pale Kings by Ben Galley, but I did not get to that one. But I did have other books that I read that did fit that prompt, like Knife of Dreams. Legend of the Phoenix Resurgence also had some battles and kind of a war going on. Then for Olive Tree, a book that has a competition, and for that I read A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair. And lastly, for the team prompts, it was Owl, a book with a mentor. And for that I read Of Claws and Inferno by Kyoko M, and that is the 5th book in the Of Cinder and Bone series. Now for the main prompts. Armor of Achilles, a comfort read, and for that I read Spelling the Tea by Erin Johnson. Next up is Apollo's Lyre, your most read genre, and that for me, that's fantasy, obviously. And I was supposed to read The Heart of the Bloodstone by Philena Wood, and this is the first book in the Stone Tribe series, and I did start this one, but I did not finish it in September. For Zeus's Bolt, read the book at the top of your TBR, and for that I read The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. Next up is Hermes Sandals, a popcorn read, and for that I read Beyond the Veil by Pippa DaCosta. I did read that. After having read it, I could see how it could be some people's popcorn read. Not really mine, but didn't know that until after I finished it. Next up, Cap of Invisibility, a bingeable read, and for that I read Saga Volume 6 by Brian K. Vaughan. Next, Lotus Tree, read a translated book, and for that I read A Sweet Daryusia by Maria Matios. Poseidon's Trident, a book that was part of a trilogy. For that I read Raising Steam by Terry Pratchett, and that is the 3rd and final book in the Moist von Lipwig sub-series of Discworld. Scale of Justice, a possible 5-star read. And for that, I read A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers. This is the second book in the Wayfarer series, but sadly was only a 4-star. It was not quite a 5-star. It was a 4-star. It was a very good book, but not quite a 5. Ambrosia, the book longest on your shelves. And I read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clark. I have had this on my TBR for so long, and I finally got up the courage to read it, and also it was a book club book for the Game of Tomes. So that helped a lot. It was so good. I don't know why I waited so long. If you like Sherlock Holmes style writing, then you will probably like this book. It's very long, but it's so good. Prometheus Chains, link to a previous book. And for that, I read A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair. And this one linked back to the book I read right before it, which was Camp Half-Blood, and they were both mythology-based books. Pandora's Box, an intimidating read, which definitely could have been Jonathan Strange. But instead I read Hex Life, and that is by a variety of authors because it is an anthology of short stories, and I do not typically like short stories, so they are always intimidating. Then lastly, Trojan Horse, a book with a plot twist, and for that I chose The Nightshade Cases Freak Show, and this is by Patty Larson, and I chose this because it was kind of a mystery thriller, and those tend to have some plot twists here and there, which, I mean, it kind of did. But again, it was a little too short for me. So I liked it, but didn't love it. And then that brings us to September's Seasonathon Academy, put together by Completely Melanie. And this one was so much fun. So we had 5 prompts there's 5 mandatory prompts or classes that you need to fulfill. The first one was English 2010. Read any book you like and post a review. Now, most people were super intelligent and they put the group book in this space. Did I do that? No, I did not. So then I had to read all 5 prompts and the group book instead of just adding it into that space. I don't know what I was thinking, but instead I chose A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair, because that is one that was on my TBRopoly and a couple of the other readathons, so I wanted to make sure I got that in. English 2130, read an American classic or an American banned book. And I read an American classic that was banned at one point, and that was Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. So those were the 2 prompts that everybody had to do. All the rest of the classes, you had some options. So from the natural science category, I chose a General Physics 1030, read a sci-fi and post a review. And of course I post reviews on Goodreads, Storygraph, and also here on YouTube, so I got that done easily. But I read Of Claws and Inferno, which is the 5th and final book in the Of Cinder and Bone series by Kyoko M, and this book was so good. The whole series is amazing. I love it. So good. You have to read it. They're so good. Anyway, moving on. Then you had to select from non-Western culture category, and I chose World Geography 1030, read a book set in a country other than the US or the UK. And for that I read Sweet Darusia, which was set in the Ukraine, and that is by Maria Matios. And then of course I read the group book, which was The Obsidian Tower by Melissa Caruso, and I was able to get that from my library, and it was so good. I love that book. I cannot wait to read the next book in the series. So I did complete both the Goddess Complex and Seasonathon Academy, because Goddess Complex, you didn't have to read something from every prompt. You just had to read like a team prompt and a couple of the main prompts. So I got that done. Team Athena did not win, but that's okay. We had a lot of fun. And for Buzzwordathon, our prompt was senses, and I picked A Touch of Darkness, because touch, by Scarlett St. Clair. And then lastly for the readathons for September was the Magical Readathon, the Autumn Equinox. And for Ariel, my first character, she was going for the Master of Elements, and she had to get an O, which only one book, for animal studies, and for that she read Legend of the Phoenix Resurgence by Joel Poe. Next she had to read Astronomy, another O class, so just one book, and the prompt for that is book released in your birth month. That took me a little while, but I was able to find a short book for that one, and that was A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And I did not realize until after I'd finished it, this was his debut book. with Sherlock Holmes. That was so exciting. So you got to see how Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson met, and it was great. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Next, Elemental Studies. She had to get a D, so she had to read 3 books for this one. The first book was A Favorite Scent in the Title or on the Cover, and for this one I kind of stretched it a little bit, but it was The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe, and I do love the scent of fall. So you've got like the nice cool crisp air, the leaves, pumpkin, you know, all of that fun stuff. You start getting the smell of spices and like your cinnamon and cloves and allspice and like all that in the air, and it's just beautiful. So Fall of the House of Usher. For Q, 100 pages bigger than your last book, and the book I read right before this one was 128 pages, so it had to be bigger than that, and this book was 224 pages. And I read Do Bigger Things by Dan McClure, and that also was a good book. I got quite a few good tips out of that one. And then for D, the last book is Sparks on the Cover, and for that Ariel read Beyond the Veil by Pippa DaCosta, and if you look close enough, there's some sparks on the cover there. You got some little sparkles here by the sword and then up here by the V. So she did complete that one. And then we have Restoration, so she needed to get a Q in that one, so that's 2 books. The first prompt for O is Night Sky on the Cover, and for that Ariel read A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers, which is the 2nd book in the Wayfarers series. All right, for prompt for the 2nd book for Q was A Poisonous Plant. And for this one, Ariel read Unreal Alchemy by Tansy Rayner Roberts. And this is the first book in the Belladonna University series. And this book was adorable. It's definitely a popcorn read on this one. And bingeable. Super cute. Then lastly, for Master of Elements, she had to take Shapeshifting, and that was another O, so just the 1 book. And Jewelry on the Cover or in the Title. And for that, Ariel read The Inheritance Game by Jennifer Lynn Barnes, the first book in the series, and the cover itself has some jewels in it. So she did pass Master of Elements. Next, she had to take Feywild Cartography because she is a double major. So she does have the 2 callings. So for Feywild Cartographer, she had to take Alchemy, and that's an O, so just the 1 book. And for that one, the prompt is Make You Emotional, and she read Quicksilver by Callie Hart, and this one, the dude is crying on the cover, so I figured there'd be something in there that makes you emotional. And it definitely isn't something that made me cry or anything, but there was some emotions in there. So there's at times when things just make you angry, other times it's just super heartwarming. There's one character in here, it was a little side character, but oh my gosh, he was just adorable. So yes, lots of little heartwarming moments in there. Okay, next. Animal Studies, which we just talked about. Between the 2 callings, like she had to take Animal Studies for both, so she didn't necessarily read 2 books, she just went to the same class, and that counted for both callings, which is really nice. And again, that's Phoenix on the cover or in the title, and that was Legend of the Phoenix Resurgence by Joel Poe. Next up, Astronomy, a book released in your birth month, and again, that was A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and that was released in December. Next up, Demonology, and that's just an O, so just the 1 class. A non-reader picks your book, and for this one, I wrote down 4 different book titles, and then I gave it to my husband and told him to pick a book. And these were ones that I wanted to read, and I just let him pick out of those 4 which one he thought I should read, and he chose A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair because he thought the name sounded intriguing. And then Elemental Studies was an O, and for that the prompt is Favorite Scent in the title or on the cover, and again that was The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. And then lastly, Inscription, which was a Q, so I had to do 2 classes for that one. First one is all the letters of your first name in the title. And I've done this one before with my name, and trying to do Deborah, or Debbie, the way I spell it, D-E-B-Y-I. I cannot find books with, if there's a D or a B, there's not typically a Y, which is just weird. I don't know. I have so much trouble trying to find all the letters of my name. So this time, I got smart and I used Ariel's name. And for that, she read of Claws and Inferno by Kyoko M. So there's an A, an R, an I, an E, and an L in the title. And then for the last one was for Q, color wheel, a title color. So the title of your book had to be in that color. And so she spun the wheel and she got red. And for this one, she read Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. So Ariel did complete both her callings of Master of Elements and Feywild Cartographer while reading some great books. And she did complete it in the time frame allowed. Next, we have Karasu. Now, Karasu is a super overachiever. He also has trouble making up his mind. So he couldn't decide between 3 different callings, so he just decided to do them all. Let's start with Aeldia Excavationist. This is one he started. It was a new calling that was offered, I think it was in the spring of this year. And so he jumped right on that one because it fits well with his personality and everything. And actually it's fairly easy class, I would say. It's fairly short class. There's not as many things that you need to do with this one. But the first one was Animal Studies, and it is a D, so he had to read 3 different books for this one. And the first prompt was Phoenix on the cover or in the title. And he, of course, could not read the same books as Ariel. He had to have all different books because that would be somewhat cheating. And for this one, he read The Phoenix and the Turtle by William Shakespeare. And this one is fairly short, but he did have to read it twice because the first time you're like, oh, this is so beautiful. And you're like, I have no idea what I just read, but it was really pretty. So then you read it again and you kind of look past the pretty part and how it sounds and actually try and figure out what the book is. So he did have to read it a couple times, but he did get that done. For Q, he had to read a standalone book. And for that, he read Jonathan, because the overachiever he is, he read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. And then for the final prompt for Animal Studies, he had to read a book that had a cover change. He decided to go with A River Enchanted by Rebecca Ross, which had multiple covers. And then he had to do Restoration, and that was 2 books that he had to read for that one. That was a Q. And so for O, he had to read a book with a night sky on the cover, and he read Hex Life by a variety of authors. It's a collection of short stories. And then for Q, Poisonous Plant on the cover or in the title. And for that, he read Freak Show by Patty Larson, and this is the first book in the Nightshade series. So he did complete Aeldia Excavationist in the allotted time. Next up, we had Godseer. Since he is part of the Archivist Guild, he decided he needed to do the Godseer calling because that is only available to those who are archivists. So this one is a little more intense of a calling, and he had to start with Conjuration, and that one he had to get a Q, so 2 books. And the first one is Bat on the Cover, and he read A Shadow of the Batgirl by Sarah Kuhn, and this one was really good. He enjoyed it. Next, for Q, a book that has won an award, and he lucked out with this one because he read the wonderful book Cinder, which is the first book in the Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Meyer. Next up, Demonology. Now, he did get to go to class with Ariel for this one, so that was fun. For the prompt, he had to read A Non-Reader Picks Your Book. And so for this one, my husband got to pick whatever book he wanted. I didn't give him any options or anything. He just picked whatever he felt like giving me. I was a little nervous because I figured he would give me some kind of investment book or some kind of high financial book that I would not understand at all. Way over my head. He thoroughly surprised me by choosing Autobiography of a Yogi, and I'm going to read it from the book because I don't want to get it too wrong. And this is by Paramahansa Yogananda. And this one was very interesting, and I am glad he suggested it. Next up, Inscription. 1 book for this one. The prompt is Title has all the letters of the first name. And as I just discussed with Ariel's class, I was not going to choose my own name. So I also then chose Karasu's name for this one, which I was thinking it was going to be a little hard as well just because of the K in there, but I didn't have to look very hard because Katana of Trust by A.C. Ward has K-A-R-A-S-N-U in it. It worked great. Next we had Lore, and this is another D, so he had to read 3 different books for this one. And the first prompt is a vampire book, but it is Awakened Vampire, and this is by Kestra Pingree, and it is the first book in the Nightshade Academy series. Very cute. Next prompt was a translated book, and for that he read Sweet Daryusia by Maria Matios, and this is translated from Ukrainian. And lastly, for lore, he had to read a retelling, and for this one he read What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher, and this is a retelling of the fall of the House of Usher. Next up, Restoration. And for this one, he had to have a cue, so 2 different books for this one. For the first prompt, it's Night Sky on the cover, and for this one, he read Hex Life, and that's again by a variety of authors. It's an anthology. For cue, Poisonous Plant in the title, and that is from the Nightshade Cases, and this one is Freak Show, and this is by Patty Larson. So he did complete the Godseer calling in the time allotted. And I keep saying that because now we are up to Scribe. For Scribe, he had to take 4 different classes, and the first one was Elemental Studies, but he only needed an O for that one, and this was your favorite scent in the title or on the cover, and for this he read Spelling the Tea by Aaron Johnson, and he did finish that class. And then he had to take Lore, and this one he did need a Q, so 2 different classes, and for this one it was a vampire book, and he did read Awakened Vampire, which is from the Nightshade Academy series, and it's by Kestra Pingree, so he did finish that one. Next prompt was, again, a translated book, and he did read Sweet Daryusia by Maria Matios, so he did complete Lore. And then we had Restoration, just an O, and the prompt is Night Sky on the cover, and again, that was Hex Life, so he did get to read that same book for all 3 of the callings, which was very nice. And then we get to Inscription. So this one he does need a D, but as you can tell, only 2 of those squares are colored in because he has not completed his 3rd prompt yet. So the first prompt was, again, title has all the letters of your first name, and so again by A.C. Ward we have Katana of Trust. And then we had a color wheel, title color, and for that he got brown. And he read The Obsidian Tower by Melissa Karasu, and that was a great book, and he did finish that one. And then the last class for D was author mentioned in recent 5-star read. Now this one took me a long time to figure out what I was going to do for it. I kept going further and further back, but then I realized in the acknowledgments you had to have like mention another author, and the book I was looking at was from David Estes and the Kingfall Histories, and David Estes and Bengali have written books together, and so they of course mention each other, and that is actually how I found Bengali, was through David Estes. And so I went with Pale Kings, which is the 2nd book in the Emaneska series by Bengali, but Karasu did not read this book and still has not yet read this book, but it is on his TBR for November, so it will get read in November. So he did use some Guild Emporium points to extend his class, so he does have till the end of the year to finish this book and still complete his calling. And that is all of the readathons for September. Now let's move into October's readathons. October. Let's start with the Seasonal Spooky Challenge. And again, this one is with covers with Cassidy, and this one we did a little better. So for the urban, we had done A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair in September. In October, we did the Summer Camp prompt, and that fit with a young adult book, and that is Camp Lanier by Sylvester Barzy, and did finish that one. Okay, and then we did Small Town and New Release, because you have to get both of these sections together, and I read Creeper's Landia Origin, Pumpkin Man 2 by Penny Moons, and I did like the first book better. This is the 2nd book in the Pumpkin Man series. The first one is Pumpkin Man Jane, and I did like that one a little better, but this one was really good too. Super fun, has that good cheesy slasher vibe, but also gives you those nice Halloween feel, and yeah, perfect for the spooky season. For Southern, and on someone else's TBR, that one I read The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. For Coastal, and a new author to me, that one I read Monsters Born and Made, and this is by Tanvi Burwa. And then lastly, you can double up on prompts. So if you can find one book that matches all of these, go for it, she said. But I do have some other books from November that I could probably put on here, but for now, for In the Woods and Diverse Rep. Again, we have Camp Lanier by Sylvester Barzy. Not the best book I've ever read, but it was good. And then for cover prompts, I still need to do hands and I need to do window. So I mean, Camp Lanier has windows on there. I mean, they're lit up here and then also up here. So I could use that, but I'm waiting to see if I have a book that has more of a window on it, like the focus is more on the window. If not, then I will totally use that book. And then we had Weapon on the Cover. I could use just about any book I have on my November TBR because there's a sword on the majority of the books that I'm reading in November, which is kind of weird, but any of those could work. But I actually used Blood Hunter by Morgan Quaid, and this cover doesn't actually have a weapon on it, but this cover does, of the same book, so I chose that one. For Animal, I had Shadow of the Batgirl in September. And then for Blood, there's a few books I can add on here, but none of the ones I read in October I think had the majority of the cover in Blood, but one of the ones I read in November does, so I will fill you in on that one once November is over. And then for Tech, there's two different books I could put on here, and they're both from September, and that was Cinder by Marissa Meyer and Saga. And then Water, again, we have Camp Lanier. For the bonus challenges, for Vampires was Awakened Vampire. For Serial Killer, again, Camp Lanier. For Ghosts, we also have Camp Lanier, which actually fits better than Saga Volume 6, so I'm going to go with Camp Lanier for that one. That one fit a lot of these prompts, actually. It was pretty nice. Cults, Blood Hunter also fits for that one. And then Cannibals, again, one of the ones I read in November. Fit that. So that was the seasonal spooky challenge. I have basically just the two left that I need to read is Hands and Window. Everything else I got. Nice. So almost done. So I need to read a book with hands on the cover in November. I need to look and see if I have that. And Window. I'll need to double check those. I'll let you know how I did at the end of November. Next up we have Spookoplathon. I lucked out and did not get any doubles, which was great because my own TBR gave me enough. So my first prompt I landed on Present, and for that I read Gunmetal Gods by Zamir Akhtar, and that's the first book in the series. I did finish that one, it was very good. Next I landed on Bone, which means you needed to read a book that had bone color on the cover. And for that I read Death Whisper, and since there's bones, and they are the color of bones, I feel like this one totally worked. And I loved the book too, it was really good. Third roll I landed on Grady Hendrix, which worked out really well because I was reading the 7 Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. So that worked. Next up, a big book, over 500 pages. Again, fairly easy. I had multiple on my TBR for October. But I chose Empire of the Vampire by Jay Kristoff, and I loved this book. So good, one of my favorites of the month. Next was Present, so a book that you currently would like to read, and for that I read A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, and this is the first book in the Akhtar series. Then lastly I landed on Leatherface, and this one had to have a family dynamic in it, and I read Ghost in the Spell, which is the 5th and final book in the Grimoires of a Middle-Aged Witch series by Renee George, and I love this series. It is just so much fun. And I definitely read it, and I finished Spookoplathon. Okay, next was Buzzwordathon, and the word for October was relationships. So you had to have mother, husband, daughter, sister, something like that in the title, and I read Something is Killing the Children, Volume 1 by James Tinian IV, and that was a great graphic novel. Next was Adventures in Aeldia, so continuing in our magical readathon, the year-long readathon. For Ariel, she had to read a book that had a house as the main character or the main setting of the book. And for that she read Loftus, The Hall of Dreams, and this is by Helena B. Scott, and this was all about a haunted house in Ireland. And for Karasu, he had to read a book that was currently popular, and at the time I was picking this out, everyone was putting The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix on their TBR, and so I did as well. Next was The Library of Dragons by Books to Ashes. The first prompt was Dragon's Hoard, gold or silver on the cover, and for this one I read A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, and the title was in yellow, which would be gold. Next, Closing Shifts. The final page ends in a 3 or a 5, and I found a book that its last page was 475, and that is Gunmetal Gods by Zamil Akhtar, the first book in the series. Next, you got to choose your career and a secondary career, so you could do 2. And I chose an apothecary shopkeeper, and the prompt is a book that features wizards or medicine, and I chose Ghost in the Spell by Renee George, and this one had witches in it. And then for librarian/scribe, you had to read a book about a book. She said that if we read a book about a book in the Magical Readathon in September, that we could then count that for this prompt, and so I did, because I did not get around to another book for this prompt. And I read in September Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, which is a book about burning books. Lastly, I had my 13 Spooky Reads little spinner wheel readathon, I guess you could call it, sort of. And this one I had to read 13 spooky books, and I put 31 books into a spinner wheel, and then I spun it 13 times to get some spooky books. And of course, most of these I'm putting on there blind just by the cover or by the title, thinking they're all spooky reads. Well, I was incorrect. You can watch my wrap-up for the 13 spooky reads. I'll leave that up in the cards above for you. So, I mean, most of them had monsters or something in them, but they definitely were not giving me that fall-autumn vibe at all. Some of them were in the summer, and yeah. But it was super fun, and I read some great books. But the first one that I got was Monsters Board and Bait by Tanvi Burwa, and I did finish that one. That one had some great monsters in it, but not really any kind of spooky or fall vibes. Next, I read Evocation by S.T. Gibson, which did have some good kind of spooky vibes because it had some psychics and medium kind of things going on. But then you had this like romance all of a sudden. Like it went from being like a curse and the psychics and mediums kind of thing to now it's a romance book. And then at the very end, you had just a little bit left of what originally happened. So it's kind of like the book got hijacked by a romance for a minute. I thought the romance was fine to have in the book, but it took too much of a front seat and needed to move back to the back seat again. The third book that I read also had some good Halloween or some good fall spooky vibes, and that was Empire of the Vampire by J. Kristoff. I loved this book, one of my favorites of the month. And then I read Gunmetal Gods by Zamil Akhtar, and again, super good book with lots of great action. It has some great monsters in it, but not necessarily the fall spooky vibes. But it was really good. And then I got Death Whispers by Tamara Rose Blodgett, and I love this one. This one is a YA, so it's more of a spoopy book, but this one had Raising the Dead and some good Halloween vibes and stuff like that, and it was good. And then I read Ghost in the Spell by Renee George, which is the 5th book in the Grimoires of a Middle-Aged Witch series, and that was great. It had all of the fun witchy vibes, but again, not necessarily fall or spooky. But it was a great spoopy book. And then was The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix, which had some good spooky vibes to it, but it was just okay. And then I read Loftus, The Hall of Dreams, which is by Helena B. Scott, and it is about a haunted house in Ireland. And this one had some great ghosts and chill factor to it. It was really interesting. It was written more as like a nonfiction, but with kind of a fiction story wrapped around as the ghost was the one kind of telling the story. Next up was Blood Hunter by Morgan Quaid. And this is a Seven Hungers novel, The Petra Graves Chronicles, Book 1. I will definitely be continuing with this series because it was very interesting and I really enjoyed it. If you need a book with a cult in it, that one has it. Another one that had some good kind of somewhat spooky but not really spooky vibes. That was really interesting and somewhat intriguing, but also ended up kind of falling flat, I think, towards the end. And that is Cthulhu's Children by J.E. Murphy. It was interesting, but it didn't give me the vibes I I was expecting. So I was thinking, you know, this is going to have like the H.P. Lovecraft spooky vibes, but sort of. It was definitely written for upper middle grade YA, so I think that was part of it. Sorry if you heard Walter barking in the background. Book number 11 had kind of the sinister kind of spooky vibes that I was kind of looking for the Halloween season, and that was Hunted by Charles Welsh. It's not a super long story, it's fairly short, but it was good and quite atmospheric. The next book had kind of the mystery vibes to it, so it had some good atmosphere that way, but it wasn't necessarily spooky or set in fall necessarily, but anything kind of set in England when you have like the fog coming in and some of that, it kind of gives you a little bit of sinister vibes to it. But that was Spellbreaker by Charlie N. Holmberg, and I do have the second book in the duology, so I'm hoping I can finish the full duology up this year. We'll see. And then book number 13 for my 13 spooky reads was Camp Lanier by Sylvester Barzy, and this one did have the good ghosty spooky vibes, so that was kind of nice to close out the readathon with a good spooky book. But it was set in summer. It still didn't give me the fall vibes. So then just kind of on my own, once I got back from the wheelhouse, I read Pumpkin Man 2 Origin Story from Creeperslandia by Penny Moons, and that one was just the right way to end the whole kind of series, the 13 Spooky Read series. And yeah, gave me the good fall vibes because you have Halloween, and yeah, it was great. And that was it for my September and October readathon wrap up. I will be doing a Q4 wrap up at the end of the year and kind of my year-end stats and all of that. So thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and please like, comment, and subscribe if you want it, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any other bookish content from me. And if you made it this far in the video, leave some sort of a spooky or dragon emoji in the comments to let me know that you were here. And until next time, keep reading. Bye!